Okay, we'll just give it a couple more seconds, guys, just to let everybody join who's waiting. We won't be long and we'll get started. Okay, I can see that number going up. Brilliant. Okay, I think we'll make a start. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. It is really great to have so many professionals join us from across industry. If you joined last month's webinar, welcome back. And if this is the first Phoenix webinar that you've attended, a very big welcome to you too. We are really pleased to have you all with us today to explore our topic of the day, which is the competence gap, why most organizations are less defensible than they think. So during this session, we'll be exploring the real meaning of competence and the difference between having the training records and documentation versus having confidence that capability genuinely exists, where those critical safety decisions are actually being made. Leading the session today, we have Toby Bidwell. Toby is one of the industry's leading voices in operational safety capability, organizational defensibility, and risk readiness. And here at Phoenix, he works directly with organizations right across the UK, helping them strengthen operational visibility, leadership accountability, and risk management capability. So you're definitely in great hands today. So without further ado, Tobe, over to you to get the session started, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karina, and a good morning to everybody in attendance. It's great to have you as part of this session, and hopefully you'll come away from this session with some key takeaways that are going to help you and benefit you and your organisation moving forward. So to look at the session overview, just to make it clear, this isn't a compliance session. It's about defensibility under scrutiny, because generally speaking, organizations don't fail because they don't try. They fail because they can't evidence decisions when they're challenged. So we're going to look at what competence really means. So the difference between training, knowledge, capability, and competence demonstrated in practice. And we're going to focus on the SCEB framework. I'm sure many of you are familiar with SCEB, but we'll hone in on exactly what that is shortly. We're going to look at where organizations become exposed, the most common competence gaps identified after incidents, investigations, insurer scrutiny, and regulatory enforcement activity. And we're going to look at how competence is tested. So what regulators, insurance, claimant lawyers look for after a serious event. We're going to hone in particular on an interview under caution and what that entails. And then we're going to look at what good practice looks like. So a practical framework for building visible competence, structured oversight, defensible governance, and continuous improvement across your organization. I'm sure all of the health and safety practitioners on this session are well aware of the focus on competence currently. Now, it's important to us at Phoenix that we tailor the session to suit your needs. We want you to have as much insight to take away off the back of this session. So I'm going to come across to Hannah for a moment, and we're going to open up our first survey. And we'd like to know which best describes your role. So are you an owner or a director of a company? Are you a middle manager with health and safety responsibilities, such as a facilities manager? Or are you a health and safety dedicated professional? Or are you other? So over to you, Hannah, to open up that survey.
Yeah, survey's running. We'll just give it a couple of seconds. I think nearly everyone's voted.
Excellent. And what's the results that we've had, Hannah?
Okay, so we've got 7% owner and director, 24% middle manager, 55% health and safety professional, and 14% other.
Excellent. Well, a real mixed bag. So we'll tailor the session the best way that we can for you guys. And we do love surveys at Phoenix. So we're going to introduce the first proper survey of this session. And we'd like to know, if your organization's competence were questioned tomorrow, could you defend it with confidence? Would you answer yes, that you've got structured oversight? You may not be sure. You have some controls in place, but not quite sure how defensible they are. Or no, you don't feel competent and recognize that there are gaps. And something that we'd like to say from the start to everybody in attendance, be honest with your answers, and your answers, they're not visible to others as well. So it's a confidential answer. And how are we looking so far, Hannah?
We're just at 70% of participants engaging, so just give it a little bit longer.
Absolutely. I'm sure that 100% want to engage in this, so we'll wait a few more seconds.
Okay, so we've got 29% have said yes, 32% have said no, and 39% have said not sure.
Okay, and again, a fairly even split there. So great. We'll see how you all feel as this session goes on. So many organisations confuse training with competence, and there is a fundamental difference between having completed a course and being able to demonstrate real competence. So certificates and attendance records, they don't guarantee that people will make the right decisions when it matters most. So training evidence usually includes certificates, it could be attendance records, toolbox talks around the yard or the workplace, theoretical knowledge assessments. But real competence, it requires the right decisions under pressure, being able to apply effective judgment in real situations, be able to demonstrate a practical ability within the role, and have behavior consistent with the required standards. We'll talk about culture and behavioral traits as we go through this. And a bit of an example really would be, take work at height, for example. You could have an employee that's completed work at height training. They understand ladder safety, edge protection, fall risks, etc. But on site, they make that decision to stand on the top rung of the ladder just to finish a job off quickly because it's faster. So when we look at that, training existed, that their knowledge existed, but the decision making failed, and behavior under pressure exposed a gap. So it's really key to understand, and through the eyes of the enforcement authority, that training alone doesn't deem competence. And training is not what gets tested. Decisions are what gets tested. Who made the decision? Were they competent to make that decision? So what is competence? So competence, it's not a single attribute or a single thing. It's a combination. And when the HSE view competence as a whole, they go by the acronym of SCEB. So there are 4 individual elements of SCEB. We have the skills, so the practical application of controls, identifying unsafe conditions, supervising others. We then move on to knowledge, understanding legal duties, identifying suitable controls, knowing escalation points. We then have experience, and we're going to hone into each one of these elements shortly. So with experience, the quality of judgment, decision making, escalation capability. And then we have behavior, risk tolerance, leadership standards. What is the culture like of that organization? It's important to note that a weakness in one of these elements could mean overall failure. So let's have a look at each of those elements of SCEB. So first we have skills. So, can the individual actually apply the controls? So it's not enough to know the procedure. The person needs to be able to implement it correctly and consistency within their working environment. Can they identify unsafe conditions? So a competent person, they must recognize risks before they escalate, not just react when something has already gone wrong. And can they supervise others competently? So effective supervision, it requires a supervisor to have sufficient skills to assess the team's work and detect deviations from the expected standards. And that brings us on to knowledge. So knowledge is a theoretical foundation that enables people to understand why rules and controls existed, not just how to apply them. And without adequate knowledge, decisions are based on assumptions with potentially serious consequences. So do they understand their legal obligations? Those responsible within the organizations, they must understand what the law requires of them, not just what an internal manual or policy says. And it's really important to note that under the Health and Safety at Work Act, as many of you will be aware, ignorance is not a valid defense through the eyes of the laws. So can you identify appropriate controls? So proper knowledge makes it possible to select controls that are proportionate to the risk, rather than applying generic measures that don't address the specific hazard. And the key word there is proportionate, knowing what is reasonably practicable. we'll hone in on that shortly. So do they know when to escalate? So is that clear? Do the workforce know who to escalate certain matters to? So when a situation exceeds one's own competence, for example, and must be referred to a higher level, is a sign of mature and responsible knowledge. And again, many of us on this call would be members of IOSH or FIIRSM. And when we look at the values, understanding one's competence is one of the key values there. And then experience. So I've lost count of how many times over the years I've been told that somebody's competent because they've got time served experience. Well, actually, an individual, whilst that is often the case, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've been exposed to a positive experience. It may be many years of bad practices. So again, it's the quality of that experience that matters. So when it comes to judgment, experience develops the ability to assess a complex situation and reach a reasoned conclusion, even under pressure or with incomplete information. And the quality of decisions, as I've just mentioned, they're made by people with appropriate experience that are stronger, more proportionate, and more defensible when later challenged. And then escalation capability. So experienced professionals know when a situation exceeds their level of competence and when it's necessary to involve others, a critical skill that is in risk management. But really just to emphasize that time served does not mean quality experience. And one of the most expensive phrases I've ever heard in business is, but we've always done it this way. And many of you health and safety practitioners on the call, I'm sure you've come across individuals, whether it's on a shop floor, for example, and they can be a bit reluctant to take on board the advice that you're giving because they've always done it this way. And again, that doesn't mean it's the right way. And then we have behavior. Behavior, I would say, is the hardest component to document and the most revealing when an incident occurs. So when the HSE undertake an investigation, they could tell very, very quickly what the culture may be like of the organization, or certainly the behavior of an individual. So, we talk about a positive culture. Well, that involves, risk tolerance. So does the organization accept risks it should or not? Are deviations from procedures normalized? So are people in the factory, are they disabling safety guarding devices, etc.? So risk tolerance reveals the organization's true cultural maturity. And then leadership standards. We know that health and safety, it needs to come from the top down, also from the bottom up, but the people at the top really need to set the standard. So visible leadership, one that demands and models the right behavior, is a powerful signal of organizational competence to any investigator or regulator. And I remember visiting a large manufacturing organization a year or so ago, and I was being shown around the premises with the health and safety manager. And then we noticed an individual walking through the warehouse in shorts and Crocs of all thing on their feet. So terrible fashion sense as well. But that individual turned out to be the managing director of the company. So that spoke volumes as to the behavior and the culture. And then consistency under pressure. Do standards hold when there is pressure from the time, cost, or production? We need to get the job out the door. We've got the delivery guys outside waiting. Again, it's being able to keep your integrity intact and make the right decisions, the competent decisions, when you're under those types of pressure. Because ultimately, behavior is what gets exposed under pressure. So we're going to take a look at the competence gaps. So competence gaps, they're rarely visible until something forces them to open. Yet these weaknesses exist in most organizations, and they're exactly what regulators, not just regulators, but insurers and lawyers look for when something goes wrong. So training without verification. So very often we see, organizations, they provide training for their employees, but then it sort of stops there. There's no further validation that the skills and the knowledge that they gain from that training course is actually being implemented into practice. Weak supervision, so people are assigned to high risk tasks without supervision appropriate to their actual level of experience. And we talk about competence frameworks when we talk about what good looks like. Assumptions about capability. As health and safety leaders, it's our duty of care to make sure that we know confidently the competence of individuals within the organizations, bearing in mind, human nature. Many individuals will be resilient to put their head above the parapet, for want of a better phrase, to confirm that they may not feel competent in a particular task. So it's key that we create that culture that enables the voice to be heard and raised when needed. So it's assumed that someone is competent because they've been in the role for years and completed training years ago. Their actual capability has never been formally verified. And no competence review process, and it's really important, especially with a focus on competence, that actually you're able to stand up and say, we are competent. We've got a framework, we've got standards that underpin our practices. And we'll talk about competence review processes as this session goes on. And the reality is that most organizations that we meet with, they want to do the right thing. That's why they partner with Phoenix. But quite often they only know what they know. So most organizations, I would say, they don't know the gaps exist until after an incident. That's why the proactive approach is always most important. And we're going to look at what investigators are really looking for. So the health and safety executive we'll cover off, and then we'll move on to insurers and claimant lawyers. So the HSE, so they want evidence of documented and verified competence. So they want to see competence frameworks documented, adequate and up-to-date risk assessments that are suitable and sufficient. They've not just been a tick box exercise. Safe systems of work implemented and communicated. Again, organizations we meet with, they may provide general health and safety training, manual handling, worker height, but then when it comes to work equipment, they've not produced a safe system of work. Supervision and follow-up records, something that the HSE want to see, and then evidence of continuous improvement. So, we can't change everything overnight, but we need to be able to demonstrate that we are continuously improving our health and safety practices. And the likes of the HSE, they're not looking for perfection. It's about reasonably practicable, and it's that question we hear very often. How do we know that what we're doing is enough? And it's key to remember that we don't have an obligation to make the workplace as safe as possible. We have an obligation to make the workplace as safe as is necessary. And again, reasonably practicable. We can't be in a position where we're under investing in our health and safety practices, because the likelihood is that we'll be vulnerable. But then on the other end of the scale, it can be very difficult for many of you on this call would have experienced this. Trying to get resources or finance to improve health and safety practices. It can be really challenging if you've not taken a pragmatic approach and you're recommending something that probably actually is overinvestment and not quite required. So it's that finding that middle ground. That's the key, and you can do that by liaising with like-minded, pragmatic health and safety practitioners. So then we're going to look at insurers and claimant lawyers. We see this very often, and I've got an example to show you in a moment. They want to see strength and governance of control systems, traceability of key decisions and who made them, defensibility in claims in court, consistency between documentation and real-world practice, and then evidence that reasonable and proportionate steps were taken. Now, insurers, they have a way of not asking to see certain evidence policies, risk assessments, training, etc., until after something has gone wrong. Now, what you see here it's an extract from a real solicitor letter. We used to see them on the TV. Have you had an accident at work? Or your phone rings and I'm calling you about the accident you've had at work. And they do actually end up speaking with people that have had an accident at work. So the extract that I've got here, and the emphasis is being able to have competence in this scenario. So imagine you have this letter land on your desk. In this particular case, to set the scene, there was an organization, they had a steel container outside of their industrial unit, which had an open top, and it was being used effectively as a big waste bin. To the side of the container, they had steps, but the steps only went about halfway the height that they needed to. And that meant that employees were having to put one hand on the top of the container and then sling the bag of waste over the top. And this particular individual went to do that, but as they had their hand on top of the container, they slipped and they lacerated their hand rather badly. Now, the employer, a week or so later, received this letter. And just to put emphasis on the tone of the letter that they send in, it can be quite daunting if you've not got the right competence. So why does the claimant believe the defendant was to blame for the accident? And then the key words that stand out there to me are failed. So you failed to provide the claimant with any or suitable training, supervision, or instruction. You failed to provide a safe place of work. You failed to provide a safe system of work. And then that goes on to then state the legislation or the regulations that they believe or they're claiming that the employer breached. So just imagine receiving that letter. You want to be able to demonstrate that you not only do you have risk assessments in place, but staff have been trained in the SOP or the safe system of work, that you're regularly monitoring that activity, etc. And on the last webinar, we touched base on the reality of HSE inspections. And for those of you that may not be aware, the HSE, every couple of years, they issue their annual plan. So the most recent one being their plan for 25 to 26. And they confirmed within that plan that they're aiming to do 14,000 inspections a year. So we can make an assumption of 7,000 odd a year inspections, which equates to about 30 per working day. And from the HSE's data, they've confirmed that 60% of the organisations that they inspect aren't fully compliant and result in action. So it may be an improvement notice or prohibition notice, for example. So actually, they are ramping up the amount of inspections that are undertaken, and then also the fee for intervention. It increased back on the 1st of April. And no, that wasn't an April Fool's prank, but they did increase the hourly fee to £188 per hour. So the HSE, again, many of you will be aware of this, but they identify the problem. But what they don't do is they won't prescribe solutions. So it's still on you as an organisation to ascertain what is the right solution. And again, it all comes down to having that competence to be able to establish what that is. And then fee for intervention. So we did show these in the last webinar when they were hot off the press, but what we see here are the stats for fee for intervention over the past few years. And if we took a look at last year, the average per case was £1,300. So again, it's a significant amount of money. The highest case, the highest invoice last year was £63,000, and this doesn't include any other costs. It may be civil claims that come off the back of it, or statutory fines. So we want to set the scene. So interviews under caution. So some of you may have personally sat through an interview under caution, and we're going to talk about what it is, why they may occur, etc. But imagine there's been an incident, the HSE have investigated, and then you're sat down at a table, they start recording, and the first words you hear are, "You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something you later rely on in court. Anything you do say may be given in evidence." It can be a very, very daunting scenario to be in, and they're more common than individuals think. They're far more common than criminal cases. So what exactly is an interview under caution? So an interview under caution is a formal recorded interview conducted by authorities such as the HSE under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, also referred to as PACE. It forms part of a criminal investigation and can be used as evidence in court proceedings. It is not an informal conversation. It is a serious legal process with real consequences. So common reasons for an interview under caution. It's not rare, and it's not in extreme cases only. So it could be a serious workplace incident or injury. It could be a fatality, a reportable dangerous occurrence, a significant near miss, suspected serious management failures. It could be repeated breach of regulations, failure to comply with enforcement notices, or evidence of poor risk management or supervision. So what is examined? So when you sit in an interview under caution, the discussion rarely revolves around, whether or not there was a training certificate. It revolves around whether the organisation can justify the decisions that were made. And there are typical areas of scrutiny, such as the decision making and the rationale behind that decision. Okay, so you did this. Tell me why you did this. Why did you deem this to be reasonable? Actual competencies of the people involved. Okay, what framework did you have in place to verify competence? Effectiveness of the supervision provided, quality of risk assessments. Again, so we do a doc review when we undertake a risk ready review for our clients and prospective clients, and more often than not, we see gaps in risk assessments. Effectiveness of the training delivered, leadership oversight and governance. Very often it is, okay, the standards aren't right at the top, whether previous concerns or warnings have been raised, and why controls were put in place were considered adequate. So who can be interviewed? Directors, board members, business owners, senior executives, managers, supervisors, team leaders, directly involved employees, named responsible persons. Anyone could be called into an interview under caution. And it's really important to note that, as important as documentation is, because it is very important, it doesn't stop there. Okay, so you may have documentation in place which may stipulate a process, a safe system of work, for example. Do are you confident that the guys out there in the field, on the shop floor, are following that process? So we mentioned that we love a survey at Phoenix. So what we're going to do, we're going to ask the question, and Hannah will open up the poll. But we want to know, so after what you've seen so far, has your mindset changed to how confident you are about being able to defend an organization's competence under formal scrutiny? So Hannah, over to you to open up the survey. And are you still confident? You have structured oversight. Maybe you've become more confident based on the last few slides. You may still be unsure. You have controls, but you're still not certain how defensible they would be under real scrutiny. Or you may be concerned, actually, you recognize that there are gaps, governance or oversight systems. And if you were investigated, brought into an interview under caution, that you feel that you wouldn't be able to demonstrate that competence. So Hannah, how are we looking so far?
Yeah, we've still got some rolling in, but let's see. Oh, it changes so fast. Okay. So we've got 17% are saying confident, 33% are saying they're concerned, and 49% are saying unsure. So that's gone up since this morning, the first question.
Yeah, of course. So it seems that the confidence is reduced slightly there. Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're going to move on to competence reviews. So it's really important because many organizations, they'll review financial performance, quality standards, operational performance, compliance activity, but very few in our experience formally review whether people are still competent, whether decisions are being made effectively, whether competence can be demonstrated under scrutiny, and whether roles or risk changes require competence updates. When we look at health and safety, we'll review our health and safety policy at least annually. We'll review risk assessments, generally speaking, at least annually or sooner if required. Competence is so important. We need to be undertaking the same proactive reviews, because in doing that, you will be able to evaluate skills and practical capability, technical knowledge, experience and role fit, behavioral and leadership standards, quality of decision making, and understanding escalation points. So it's really important. As part of some of you will be doing proactive audits of your health and safety arrangements. Be sure to factor in competence, because ultimately the road will, following an incident, will lead to competence. And then looking at some more information on competency reviews, what good looks like. So organizational competence reviews, generally they'll assess effectiveness of the supervision, the leadership that's in practice, visibility of competence at leadership level, management of contractor competence, monitoring and assurance processes, actual effectiveness of the training delivered. And many organizations we work with, they have their SCEB framework, so they'll take the roles within the business, whether it's a production manager or a supervisor, and they'll look at the role and they'll establish, okay, what do we deem to be suitable for the skills, the knowledge, the experience, what should their experience look like, what should their behavior look like. And those stronger organizations that we work with, they typically clearly define competence expectations, review competence periodically. Maybe that they're doing a 6-monthly internal review of their health and safety arrangements, and they factor competence into it. Or once a year, they'll do a holistic competence review. They verify capability in practice, not just on paper, and they proactively identify gaps before they escalate. They maintain clear and up-to-date audit trails, and they link competence to oversight and governance. And just that key message, really, to reiterate, competence should never be assumed simply because training has been completed. So that periodic verification and validating is what turns that training certificate that you have into demonstrable competence. So defensible organizations, they don't rely on assumptions. I think we all have heard the saying, when you assume, you make it. Right, I'm not going to finish the rest of that statement, but many of you will know what it is. They create visibility, oversight, and evidence systematically and proactively, and proactive is the key. There are characteristics that distinguish them. So clear competence expectations from the outset, defined responsibilities, role-specific competence requirements, accountability structures, and appropriate levels of authority. And structured governance, competence reviews, audits, and assurance processes, clear documentation standards, action tracking, and continuous improvement. And visible leadership and oversight. It's as the saying goes, practice what we preach. Is really important. We've got a duty of care to make sure that we are leading by example. And if we do see any activities that are unsafe, that we call it out. And then the safety culture as a whole. What are you doing to establish the safety culture of your organization? Again, in order to really understand what your culture is like, we need to really get to the meats and the bones of the behavior that you see on site, the practices that are being undertaken. And this leads us on to the risk ready review. So understanding where your organization really stands. And sometimes we can be so immersed within our working environment that we don't, we can not see the fuller picture. And actually sometimes having a fresh pair of eyes that can actually come into the workplace, do a review of activities, documentation, it can actually open up a lot of gaps that you just didn't realize were there. And that's not because you're not trying through lack of effort. It's purely because we do get a bit blindsided by our surroundings. It's a bit like you could be stood in front of a beautiful mural painting. You're really close up to it, but you can't you can't take in the full picture until you step back. And again, it's very similar to health and safety, and when we involve other like-minded pragmatic practitioners. So risk ready review, for those of you that may not be aware, it's a proactive diagnostic designed to make you aware of, validate the things that you're doing well within your organization, but then also make you aware of any areas of improvement that aren't quite meeting best practices, or even any statutory compliance gaps that may be present. The risk ready review, it covers off governance and oversight. What's the maturity of your management system, monitoring and assurance. We establish, do you have traceable and visible audits? Are you action tracking? Do you have an escalation process? And when it comes to competence as well, that's part of the review. So we don't just, establish what training has been provided. We understand, okay, so training has been provided. Is it being applied in practice? We look at operational risk management. So we review, the adequacy of risk assessments. Are there any gaps? Are they aligned to the HSE's expectations? And our controls, are they reasonably practicable? Again, the competence of the assessor is really key. implementation of controls, communication and coordination. These items are covered within that risk ready review. So it's a proactive approach of understanding, drawing a line in the sand where you're at, and then more importantly, where you need to be, and then you receive pragmatic advice of how you can get there. And then we're going to look at some steps. We during the webinar last month, we overran slightly, so didn't have as much time for your questions. So we wanted to make sure we've got time for your questions, which will come up shortly. So today's session, if you've sat during this session, I believe the survey sort of portrays this. If you're sat there and you're not quite sure of where you stand with regards to competence within the organization, or even your health and safety arrangements as a whole, well, then we've got some solutions for you as part of this webinar offering. So you can register or request a risk ready review. As you can see, the QR codes, so please feel free to scan a QR code to book in your risk ready review. And then we also have competence and capability reviews. Again, if you want us to review your competence frameworks that you have in place, if it adequately aligns with SCEB, we can also do that for you. Again, we've got a QR code there that you can capitalize on. And now we're going to open up the platform to yourself. So I'm going to come across to Karina, and Karina is going to ask any questions that we have. Open up the room to any questions. Please send them through, and I'm going to hand over to you for a moment, Karina.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Toby. There was a huge amount in there that I can imagine will resonate with many of the organisations listening today, particularly the idea that exposure often develops gradually and beneath systems that might appear compliant on the surface until something happens, and then, of course, is too late. Okay, we have already had a number of really strong questions come through. So let's move into this Q&A section now. The first one, Tobe, I've got is, what kind of questions would directors be asked under caution?
That's a great question, and I noticed in the first survey that we've got some directors on the call, so it's interesting to know if one of those is you. But directors, what they would be asked in an interview under caution, well, ultimately the buck generally stops with the director. They've got that, usually a managing director, a CEO. They've got that overall responsibility for health and safety of the workforce. So they need to be prepared that in an interview under caution, they're being tested on their control, not just the presence of any systems that may have been there. Directors, they'll be asked, what they know about the risks in the workplace, how decisions were made. Okay, so you allocated this responsibility to Joe Bloggs. How do you know that Joe Bloggs? Just talk me through how you were able to establish their competence, that they were the right fit for that role. What oversight did you, as a director, what did you have in place? So again, we know that health and safety needs to start with the top down, and directors, and going back to a point I made earlier, the HSE, they will not accept ignorance. They won't accept if a director turned around and said, I just didn't know. And the reason for that is because they legally need to know. Okay, they got a legal obligation to have access to competent health and safety advice, and to have competence within their organisation. So I hope that answers the question that you had there, Karina. And thank you to the individual that asked that question. Do we have any more come through?
Yes, we do, and they are actually coming in thick and fast, Tobe.
Oh, good.
Okay, the next one, this has come up twice actually. What does reasonable and proportionate actually look like in practice?
Great question. It can be subjective, and very often we get asked the question, how do I know that I'm doing the right thing? What is reasonably practicable? And this is where you need to consider the time, the cost, and effort that particular thing that you're introducing would take. That's really important. But again, it's that very often there's a bit of a misunderstanding that we need to make workplaces as safe as possible. That's not true. We need to make workplaces as safe as necessary, and the HSE won't expect you to do everything. They'll expect you to do the right things. And again, it's when we have a scale, and one end of the scale is that you're under investing in your health and safety, your controls are not proportionate and adequate, meaning that you're vulnerable as a business right the way to the other end of the scale, where potentially you're over investing on controls that aren't proportionate. Maybe that you're introducing certain guarding or processes or systems that aren't actually required. So again, and it could be, I remember I've been in a situation before where I used to oversee health and safety of a couple of factories, and actually having to make that decision. I was a sole health and safety practitioner, and actually it's not always easy, and there could be some really difficult decisions to make, because ultimately if something goes wrong and you're responsible for risk assessments, let's say, you need to be able to confidently back your decisions that were made. So it's really liaising with like-minded, pragmatic health and safety practitioners can really help the decision-making process that you have to make sure that you're hitting the nail on the head, basically.
Okay, thank you, Tobe. Let me come along to another one. You've got quite a few to choose from. This one's come up a couple of times. How often should competence be reassessed?
Yeah, okay. How often should competence be reassessed? Again, it really comes down, it could be subjective. It can come down to the type of the organization, it may be that the culture isn't in a great place, not where it needs to be, in which case you would do a review more frequently. But I would certainly recommend, annually as a minimum, that you're all reviewing your competence framework, your competency processes, and then sooner, if there is a reason for it, it may be post incident, or maybe when you're proactively monitoring your health and safety arrangements, you may identify something that suggests that the competence isn't where it needs to be for an individual or a team. So ultimately, it's a business decision. It should be documented within your competence framework, as in the intervals of which that competency review will be undertaken. Again, just so you can prove that it's a bit like the roots of a tree. When I talk to clients about health and safety, I use a tree analogy where the roots of that tree would be the health and safety policy, and the trunk of that tree then would be the risk assessments, and then the branches would be the control measures that stem from the risk assessments. So ultimately it is subjective, but you need to be able to document your process, so that if you are ever questioned under scrutiny, you can turn around, you can say, we have a competence framework in place. This involves, it's aligned with SCEB, skills, knowledge, experience, and behavioural traits. We also have a monitoring process to ensure the adequacy of the framework is where it needs to be. And I hope that answers the question to the individual that asked it.
Thanks, Tobe. We've had quite a few similar questions, and I think I'm safe in bucketing this into one kind of topic. So quite a few questions coming through about behaviour, mindset, culture. And I think I can sum it up by saying, what would you say is the most effective way of improving safety culture? Would you approach it from the top down or from down to top?
I think the starting point would need to be a review of the health and safety culture, because culture is not just in the actions of individuals, it extends far beyond that. But I think in doing that, undertaking a thorough review, that's going to highlight where the focus areas need to be, because it may be a top issue, it might be a bottom issue, or it might be both. But until you've actually drawn that line in the sand and undertaken a review, it's only then that you'll be able to apply your energy and your efforts in the right place. And if it is a top-down matter, quite often that's because the responsible person, or it might be a board of directors, they aren't educated in health and safety, so they don't understand the legal implications. They probably have never heard of the reverse burden of proof. So the employer, criminal law being different to, and I say this to my clients often. My wife, she's a big Emmerdale fan, and I'm sure there's more Emmerdale fans in the audience today. But usually somebody's, one week to another, somebody's up in court for a crime, and even though it's obvious that they did it, usually they're a dingle, but they would be deemed innocent until proven guilty. But the employer, under health and safety law, we have the reverse burden of proof. So the onus is on the employer. They would be considered guilty until they prove they're innocent. So quite often, if you are experiencing that issue from the top down, it's an educational piece. And this is where there are courses out there. For example, you have like an IOSH lead and safely course, which is designed to raise awareness for senior level, director level, etc. And then NEBOSH also do a health and safety leadership excellence course designed for those individuals. So again, it's usually an education piece, but quite often you can hear the gulp when you've educated them of the the legal, moral, financial implications of not having health and safety right. And then when we look at the bottom, it could be employees that are on a factory floor. Again, if the culture isn't right there, we need to understand why. And again, quite often it's an educational piece. They might see, they just may not get it. They may not understand why they need to wear their high vis or PPE or whatever it may be. But I think that having that platform, and if you're in a position where the culture isn't great on the bottom, it's been able to shift that. You need to create that environment where individuals can raise any health and safety concerns they have, hazard reporting, but then actually actioning it. And when they see that you are taking that action, they'll buy into it. And it's not an overnight fix, but that's usually a good approach to take. Very different approaches to top and bottom, but ultimately it does come down to education, really. So I hope that answers your question there, Karina.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to that, Toby, because I actually spoke to somebody at the expo in the NEC, and just you reminded me then when you mentioned the IOSH lead-in safely. For him, he had been brought into an organisation as head of health and safety, but he said the biggest change to the entire culture for him was getting the executive team on that half-day lead-in safely course. He said because he was really struggling to get the top-down buy-in. They just didn't realise the repercussions and the consequences, and also their own personal liability as directors until they underwent that. And as soon as they did that short course, they had a kind of an epiphany, a moment of realization, and they were much more supportive of everything else then he wanted to do across the company to improve the safety culture generally. But I just want to say for him, it was kind of getting that top level buy-in, and that really helped with that. I had an interesting conversation around that.
Yes, that's really interesting, and it made me think of something that I've seen many times over the years. And for those of you in the audience that you may be struggling, banging your head against the wall for the people that hold the purse strings, they're not investing in health and safety. Well, divert them to their employers' liability insurance, because 99.9% of businesses that we work with, they'll have the certificate on displayed in the office or reception. It's accessible to workforce, but they don't actually realize that behind that certificate sits the actual policy, and within that policy, more often than not, there is a section called the statement of fact. And in a nutshell, the statement of fact, it usually says something along the lines of this policy is valid on the basis that you have X, Y, and Z in place, and X, Y, and Z will usually be the relevant health and safety training, the relevant, suitable, and sufficient risk assessments. It may be their overarching health safety policy, certain processes. They will stipulate depending on the activities that are undertaken. So if those activities aren't in place, and you've been saying we need to do this, we need to do that, the other, we'll refer them to insurance, because if they've not got in place the insurance, if something goes wrong, the likelihood of them ever being able to have a payout, it reduces significantly. Because as we all know insurance companies, they're it's very naughty of them, but they do it. They'll only ask for that evidence post an incident, and you can compare it to car insurance, that they will know that the car needs to be insured, but if you were foolish enough to talk on your mobile phone and be involved in a crash, the insurance isn't going to find out when they're not going to pay out once they found out. And again, it's just that light bulb moment of getting them to understand that, okay, we think we're insured, but actually we're probably not fully insured. So there are various different ways you can approach it. And again, this is why the Phoenix, the risk ready review, the competence reviews, it's a platform for everyone in the audience to be able to ask any questions that they have and get any support they need in that regard.
Yeah. And again, just because I know you don't like to blow your own trumpet, Tobe, but these reviews that you undertake, these conversations, they come out with a solid kind of summary, what's working well in the organisation, but also where the risk areas are. Is completely complementary. It's a 60-minute assessment, and then the report is for the organisation to do what they want. If they want to work with us, great, but there's no obligation, and it is complementary. So just to remind the audience of the immense value that is provided and on offer through those reviews. We've got one more question because I've had a couple. Again, I'm bucketing it. Is what is the impact of technology, and how do we have to build that into competence as well as technology changes within the way we manage health and safety?
Okay, yeah, that is a really great question. Before I answer that, I'm just going to add on, just from what you mentioned, Karina, that the reviews, any conversations we have, they're confidential as well. So,
Yeah.
just an important one. But when I think about technology, it at the moment, the world is AI mad, AI crazy. I'm sure that most people on this call have used AI at some point today, and it's fantastic when it's used correctly. And what we're seeing at the moment far too often is that it's not being used correctly. So, for example, we see organisations that may be producing a health and safety policy. They may be undertaking risk assessments through AI, and actually it's really quite dangerous if you've got individuals within the organization that are they're responsible for undertaking risk assessments of certain activities. How do we know that they've not just started using AI? How do we know that they've got the competence to validate the output of AI? And it's really important, and this is why the HSE, they made their stance very clear a few months back, and that's if an organization is using AI in a way that could affect health and safety performance, for example, producing safe systems of work, could be maintenance processes for machinery, but then the organization needs to have a risk assessment for the use of AI within the workplace, because they need to be able to demonstrate that they're not just using it irresponsibly, that it is in a controlled way. So absolutely, you need to make sure that you got a risk assessment in place. But I think this is where it's really going to be, an initial battle of making sure that that it is utilized in the right way and people aren't going crazy with it and rolling out policies and SOPs in an uncontrolled and unapproved way. So I think AI really is the biggest focus point when it comes to technology at the moment. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Tobe. We've had absolutely phenomenal engagement on this session. So we've got loads more questions. Some of them are quite specific to certain industries and sectors and scenarios. So what I would recommend to the listeners, if that was you that submitted a question of that nature, that's where the risk ready review or the competence and capability review is really bespoke and relevant to your organisation. So Toby, I don't know if you just want to flip back and get those QR codes up just for a little bit longer, because if there are some questions unanswered and people feel that they need a bit more depth, please do book that time in with Toby. We will send a response to everybody that we haven't answered. As I say, some of them are a bit specific to go through in more detail. But yeah, book in your review session with us, and Toby will extend the conversation further. In the meantime, I think we'll wrap up there, Tobe, because we've answered the more generic questions. We will be hosting these webinars on a monthly basis. So if you don't follow us on LinkedIn, please search for Phoenix Health and Safety. Keep an eye on there. We also publish lots of relevant content and thought leadership within these types of topics. And you'll also have upcoming notice of our webinars as well. So please do follow us. But for today, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you ever so much. Thank you,
Yes, a
Toby.
big thanks to everybody, and thank you for your interaction. I hope you had some good takeaways there to help you moving forward, and we look forward to speaking with you in the near future. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.